Hello there, I'm Jimmy Vegas and this is how to create a Wolfenstein 3D FPS clone in Unity, and welcome to episode 29. This tutorial is all about post-processing, and basically if you're happy with your look of, that kind of retro look, then, you can move on to the next tutorial, no problem. But if you want to learn a little something new and a little bit something different, then this one's going to be perfect for you. Don't forget, click on subscribe button and else on game development on my channel. With that in mind, let's get to work. So basically what we intend to do here is give the game a little bit more of a modern-ish kind of look, and maybe a bit of a unique look as well, or rather you can give it a unique look with post-processing. So what is post-processing? Well, post-processing is a way of applying extra processing and imagery on top of your camera to perhaps advance the lighting, shadows, colours, all that kind of stuff. How do we get post-processing? Well, two different ways. If we go to Window, gosh, my throat's still not so good, guys. If we go to Window, and go to Package Manager, you'll see a little list like this, which will and you'll find the post-processing stack by Unity Technologies. And all you do is, same with any other asset, you will click it and just go on Import, Download, bring it into your project file, and you're ready to go. So I've already gone ahead and done it myself. Save time, get on with things, So you'll have a folder, and then you'll have some subfolders, but the one we're most interested in more than anything is this runtime folder. And this first script called post-processing behavior, the camera. Now there is one little kind of in post-processing. It may come up with an error in this min drawer. So you'll know you've got the error console. What it basically comes down to is everywhere that we have min attribute in this script, the min drawer, all we need to do is add in the word Unity Engine dot before any min attribute, and that will resolve any errors that you may have in your post-processing. Generally it will only be that one, but I think what it comes down to is Unity Technologies can be a little bit anti-beginner, if that makes sense. They kind of forget where people have to come from, and they just kind of do things off on their own, but that's not really know what this actually means. But essentially, for anyone doing this, all you need to do is add in Unity Engine there before the min attribute, and that will resolve any errors. So we have post-processing, we have all errors resolved. How do we use it? What do we do? Well, best thing for us to do is create a post-processing profile. What's a post-processing profile? It is a file or an asset, whatever you want to call it, that contains tons of information easily. Best thing to do is if we go to post-processing, I'm going to call it main profile. And you'll have, so some of these options are open and available, but by default, if you're using it for the first time, it should look a little something like this. So let's start by adding the post-processing profile to our camera. So let's go to our main camera. I should remember that file in runtime. We just need to drag and drop that post-processing onto there. And you'll see there we need to add the profile. So I'm going to double click on the controller so we can zoom in. Now everything we do in the profile runs real time, so you will see any changes within the scene. When I add the profile now, we won't see any changes because we've deferred. And we will see a slight change, and then we need to set MSAA, which is multi-sample anti-aliasing, to off. Now, this is where things get fun. If we click on main profile here, we'll be able to select the main profile and change things naturally. So let's go down the list. First up, we have fog. Doesn't really matter too much in this style of game because we're creating a very enclosed themed game, so whether it's ticked or not doesn't really matter. Next we have basically give ourselves a better way of the anti-aliasing. I've always found the best method is fast approximate anti-aliasing. It probably uses less resources, helps you fast. And preset I've always kept as default anyway because I don't think it, well, in this style, what is ambient occlusion? If we tick it, you'll see shadows appear in corners. And that's the best way of describing exactly what it is. It's a way of adding shadow to where light would otherwise struggle to get to, i.e. deep in corners. And if we change the intensity to be quite high and change the radius as well, you'll really see how that affects light. I'm now going to select the directional light, and I'm going to change the render mode to important. And point light doesn't really matter too much, but I guess we can do the same. Now that will help things look just a tiny little bit better. So if we go back to ambient occlusion, next thing, let's take a look at the sample count. I've always kept medium. However, going to high just gives a little bit extra, not detail, but makes it look a little less blocky. But if you want to go for blocky, that's perfectly fine. So let's go on low, for example, and you can see just how much that impacts it. So I'm going to set it to high just for now to see how that performs. Downsampling, I'm going to keep ticked because basically we don't want to go overboard. I mean, you could untick downsampling and you'd see the difference right there. But again, it's kind of real deep and really going for it. So if you want, well, as you can see how this looks, just that extra little bit of ambient occlusion, then yes, untick it. The rest doesn't really matter too much at all, especially in this style of game, as I've said multiple times before. So what we need to do next is let's go down to screen space reflection. A lot of these I don't really want to go into too much detail, simply because there's no point. I think it's better for you to explore a lot of what goes on here. But screen space reflection is exactly that. You can see the kind of reflection that is occurring here. Now I'm actually going to tick it and press play at this point. I really apologise for my throat, guys. And we can see how this is actually looking now. So it does kind of bring up a little bit more to the game. And this screen space reflection, if I get my words out, gives, as you can see there, a little bit of reflection in the ground. You see a reflection right there on the barrels. Now, I don't feel that this floor is reflective. I think it's more solid, so I don't think screen space reflection is going to be useful here. I guess you could, if you wanted to, give it that kind of feel, but that all comes down to how the actual tech, or rather the material, is itself. So if we go to the material down here, and let's increase the normal map to, let's say, 2, and then head back to the game, we can see just how more gritty it does look with that screen space reflection. However, I don't think it fits our game quite so well. I like killing them. So what I'm going to do is change that back to 0.3, and I'm going to get rid of that screen space reflection. But basically, it does exactly what it says on the tin. So next one, depth of field. Again, doesn't really matter too much in here because we can see the things here. We don't need this in this style of game. A lot of these, you have to remember that post-processing is designed for a lot of different style of games. So some of them are just not necessary one bit. And I don't think depth of field is going to be useful for us in this instance. Motion blur. I am going to have a little bit of motion blur here. Obviously, we know motion blur is whenever we look around quickly with the camera, we have that slight blur to kind of replicate how we would look for real. So let's press play and see how that performs. So you can see that slight blur when I move the camera. Looks kind of cool. Yep, so you can see a nice blur. Obviously, we can change the blending to be quite high, but that's going to look a little bit silly. It's like, whoa, like you're drunk. So generally, I do not have it that high. I either have it set to 0 or a very minimal amount. And obviously, you will see the difference. You really will see the difference the higher you go. So I think I'm going to keep that quite low. Same with the shutter angle and sample count. I don't think there's any point increasing them beyond their default settings. I think they serve the decent purpose. But obviously, maybe you should play around with it and try and get the right blur that you want with the motion in your turning. Next up is eye adaptation, and if I tick it, you'll instantly see it gets darker. That's all based on the histogram filter, because we can bring it down, lighten things up, I don't think there's any point in eye adaptation because, once again, this game doesn't really evolve to the point of we go into dark spaces, into light spaces, because that's what eye adaptation is. If, for example, you have a big open world RPG and you're in a dark cave and then you come out and it's really bright, the light will slowly adjust like your eyes would in real life. That is eye adaptation. And like I said, I don't think there's too much point having it here because there is no sense of going from light to dark at any point in this game. Obviously, you've got to remember as well, having too much post-processing on here can also make it look a little bit silly and also use up more resources than you would like. Next up, we have two which I feel are quite important. One is bloom and one is color grading. I'll get to the color grading after bloom. However, if I tick it and set bloom intensity quite high, you can see just how not so good it looks. So I like bloom. I am a fan of bloom, but I don't think that too much bloom is a good idea. Now, if, like this, you don't know what you've done and it just looks crazy, you've broken your game, you can always reset each of these settings by going to the little menu option here and going on reset. And that will reset it back to its default view. Now, I always like to tick anti-flicker. I like to keep the radius fairly high, but I like to keep the threshold a little bit lower than its default, but also keep the intensity at a reasonable level. So I'm going to have a very slight amount of bloom here. We can also add a dirt texture. This dirt texture will overlay on top of your camera as well to give kind of a dirty lens feel, and obviously you can change the intensity. By default, I think there are a couple of actual lens dirt textures here. So if we add it, say lens dirt 1, let's increase the intensity quite high and press play, you'll see what I mean. So hopefully you should be able to see on the screen. If I move slowly, you should be able to see the dirty lens. See over here? You can see it very slightly. Obviously with more intensity, it can get really dirty. So again, I don't think this really fits with the style of game that we've created here. So I am going to get rid of that lens dirt and keep my bloom as it is. Now, next one is color grading. Like I said, this is important. I feel that this is one of the most important aspects. So we can either make or break a game with color grading simply because it gives us the opportunity to really express colors and the style of a game. So if we tick it, we won't see much of a difference. I like to choose, rather than neutral, go for Filmic. Now, Filmic has given us a really dark, dingy, gritty feel to the game now, which I kind of like. So I think it's starting to look kind of cool with this. But again, this is just the default setting. What happens if we play around with it a little bit more? Yeah. It's actually looking quite alright, actually. So yeah, like I said, what happens if we play around with it a little bit more? Well, the post exposure, if we increase it, you can see crazy. If we decrease it, it's just dark and dismal. So it's always worth having the post exposure at least, at the very minimum, 0. I wouldn't really have it down any further because there are different ways of changing the lighting down if you need to. So if we set the post exposure as 1, give it a little bit more light. The temperature gives us like a hot and cold kind of feel. So higher the temperature, the more kind of desert feel you would have. The colder the temperature, so into a negative, the kind of more ice kind of feel. So if I reduce it, you can see it gives a blue, cold kind of feel. And increasing it gives a warm, kind of glowy, deserty, volcano-y feel. So this one is very sensitive. So I feel, in this case, just a little bit higher than 0. Tint obviously changes the entire tint. Right there. So we've got green and then, pink. So I generally don't change the tint because, once again, if we wanted that kind of color, we could change that in materials anyway. Hue shift, once again, that deals with the color. So you can see just how crazy, that kind of look. And I suppose in some ways you can use that to your advantage. So you could create a duplicate level, but now it just looks completely different because with just the flick of a switch, we've changed the complete aesthetic of this game. Cool. So I'm going to keep it as 0 for now, so standard. Now, saturation and contrast is where you can really make or break. If we increase the saturation and increase the contrast, you can see just how vibrant this now looks. And you've got to work with this just right to give it that extra sense of oomph, if you know what I mean. So I kind of like how this comes together, but it's made one thing very apparent. The ambient occlusion is too high. So let's go back to our ambient occlusion and let's reduce it. There we go. And now let's see how that looks. So this is what you should really be doing now. To get this looking how you want it, I recommend constantly testing and playing various different aspects of your game. Again, if you don't actually want any of this, then that's completely up to you. But let's reduce the contrast all the way down. You can see you end up with just a grey screen. However, if we reduce the saturation, we can turn it into something completely different once again. Now this to me kind of gives it the old black and white history film kind of look. And I guess if you want to go for that, then go for it. So I'm going to leave that like that. Channel mixer is obviously a way of mixing the colours, blending, making the reds redder and making the reds non-existent, blues, greens, whatever. So you can play around like that. I would recommend playing them, and remember you can always reset up here, there. Next on the list, we have user LUT, and this is not something we're going to use because all that really is a way of importing the colour grading from a separate file. So that's not something we'll deal with. Chromatic aberration is basically you'll see the edge of the screens go a little bit fuzzy if we increase the intensity. Now, if I've always used this as a kind of like a reference point whenever I've described this, is if you've played Resident Evil Revelations 2, if you get anywhere near a GLASP, this is the kind of look and feel that you would recognize. It's not really something suited here, but maybe for a survival horror, I think it might fit quite well, but this isn't a survival horror. Next up is grain. Grain is exactly what it says. It's a way of showing grain on the screen to give it that old kind of feel. I remember what I said about going really low on the saturation. Well, there's another way of giving that extra effect. So I'm going to take the coloured off because I just want it a black and white grain. I'm going to decrease the intensity just so we have a little bit of grain and decrease the size. And we should be able to see if I press play now. Yep, we can see the grain just a little bit and it gives it that extra something. Next up is vignette. Not pronounced vignette, it is vignette. And you'll see a border around the screen if we tick it. And once again, this adds to an extra effect of the game. And you can actually change the center of it if you want to, depending on where you want it. But you can see there, I'm moving it around like so. Change the color if you want to. So give it a red kind of look if you want it scary or whatever. Classic and masked. Masked doesn't really matter too much because that's based on a texture, but I think if you're going for this, you're better off dealing with classic. You can also change the roundness, so you can make it smooth, make it really intense, but you can see there you got a kind of letterbox feel. So generally, I'd say you're probably better off going for rounded. And yep, we've gone a bit crazy there, so let's reset. And let's reduce the intensity just a little bit. And let's press play and see how this looks. So I think we're getting somewhere with how this looks now. It looks very different than it did before. Yeah, it seems okay. So I think really all this is down to you and how you want to display your game. Dithering says right there, nothing to configure, so there's no point even talking about that. So generally, for this style of game, these are what you'll want to play with. And you can have some You can have all, you can have none if you want to. I do recommend playing around as much as you want with this. And remember, you can always start a new profile, reset these, and if you're not happy, you can just basically turn off post-processing completely, and you're left with the original. So as we've gone through this, and how it looks now, it looks okay, but then with the post-processing, you can see what I mean when it can either make or break a game, and it can really change the visual dynamic of how your game looks. So that is basically post-processing in a nutshell. I do have other tutorials on it, and if you want to take a look, perfectly fine. Let's have a quick search on my channel. So next tutorial, what we're going to do is we are going to basically create the second floor, link our splash screen and link everything together. We finish the level, move on to the next one. Until that next tutorial, guys, thank you very much for watching.